George Stinney. A name that echoes through time, lost in the silence of history, yet reverberates with injustice. A name that many have forgotten, but should never be erased. This is his story. It was 1944, a year that would mark a dark chapter in American history, and in a small, quiet town in South Carolina, a tragedy was about to unfold. George Stinney was only 14 years old, young, innocent, and full of life. A boy with a future, with dreams, with hope. But all that was about to change in an instant, in a way that no one could have ever imagined. On March 23, 1944, two young girls, Betty Mae Banks and Mary Emma Thames, went missing. Their bodies were found shortly after, dumped in a muddy ditch, lifeless. The town was gripped with fear, panic spreading faster than the whispers. It didn't take long for suspicion to settle on a young black boy named George Stinney. Why? Because he was black. In that time, in that place, the color of his skin was all it took to become a target. No evidence. No proof. Just suspicion. And yet, George was arrested. The charge? Murder. His fate was sealed the moment they put the cuffs on him. He was taken into custody, but what followed was something much worse than anyone could have imagined. The police, eager to make an example of him, pressured George into a confession. A scared, confused, and vulnerable boy was no match for the relentless interrogations. The confession he gave was not his own. It was a product of fear, of intimidation, of someone too young to understand what was happening. No lawyer by his side. No adult to guide him. Just a boy trapped in a system that cared little for his innocence. The trial came, but it wasn't much of a trial at all. It lasted less than 2 hours. The defense? Practically non-existent. A few words, and the judge had already made up his mind. The jury, too, had their decision made. In a matter of moments, George Stinney was convicted of the brutal murders of two young girls. His punishment? Death. And all of this for a boy who barely had time to understand what was happening to him. But the story didn't end there. George was sentenced to die. The execution would be swift. On June 16, 1944, just 3 months after his conviction, George was taken to the electric chair. At the time, he was the youngest person ever to be executed in the United States in the 20th century. A boy. A 14-year-old boy. He was so small, so frail, that the straps used to restrain him didn't fit. They had to stack books under his feet to ensure he reached the electrodes. It was a cruel, heartless ending to a life that should have been filled with opportunity, with growth, with joy. Instead, it ended in a flash of electricity, leaving behind only the echoes of a boy who never had a chance. But George Stinney's story didn't end with his execution. The pain and injustice he suffered didn't disappear when he was buried. Decades passed, and his name faded from public consciousness, buried under the weight of time, swept away by the tides of history. Yet his case never truly left the hearts of those who remembered. As the years went by, George's story lingered in the air like a haunting whisper, never truly silenced. Then, in 2014, something extraordinary happened. The case was reopened. Almost 70 years later, after a lifetime of silence, the truth began to come to light. A judge, reviewing the details of the case, finally declared that George Stinney had been wrongfully convicted. The confession he had given was false, coerced under duress. There was no solid evidence to tie him to the crime. The entire trial had been a mockery of justice. A system that had been so quick to condemn him was finally forced to face the truth. Innocent. George Stinney had been innocent all along. The judge's ruling declared that his conviction was a travesty, a miscarriage of justice so profound that it could never be undone. George's life could never be returned to him, but the truth was finally acknowledged. It wasn't much, but it was something. They say justice is blind, but for George Stinney, it was not just blind, it was deaf, dumb, and mute. The world failed him. The system failed him. The very people who were supposed to protect him turned their backs on him. George was never given the opportunity to grow, to live, to be more than the victim of a system that valued his life as nothing more than expendable. George Stinney was 14. A child. A son, a brother, a friend. He was someone who deserved a future. He was someone who should have had the chance to learn, to laugh, to love. But his future was stolen from him. His story was stolen from him. And yet, despite everything, George Stinney's name will never be erased. His legacy lives on. Not in the way we might have hoped, but in a way that demands we never forget. His story has become a symbol of the injustices that were so rampant in a time not so long ago. It reminds us of the power of fear, of prejudice, and of a broken system. It reminds us of the preciousness of every life and how fragile justice can be. Who was George Stinney? He was a boy, a son, a brother, a friend. A child with hopes and dreams, a child who never had the chance to see his life unfold. He was a victim of a world that judged him based on his skin color, a world that saw guilt before innocence, before the truth. He was 14, with a future that was stolen in the blink of an eye. His potential erased, his name dragged through the mud. His life taken from him before he even had a chance to live it. George Stinney's story is a stark reminder of the dangers of prejudice, the flaws of a system that is supposed to protect but too often fails. It is a warning, a painful, undeniable truth that we must never forget. His life was cut short, his name forever tied to one of the most tragic miscarriages of justice in American history. But George Stinney is not forgotten. His legacy lives on, and it will continue to inspire the fight for justice, for equality, for the protection of the innocent. His story will not be erased. Not now. Not ever. George Stinney. Gone, but not forgotten.